Hello and good evening. Welcome to GMing from the Ground Up, Episode 2. Thank you everyone for joining. I wanted to recap what we're doing here. We are starting from scratch to create a campaign that eventually those of us who are willing to take part in can GM for our first times in this game world that we'll be creating together. It's primarily based off of Children of Midnight Coven game system that Anya and I built. However, most of these GMing principles, tips, and tools are going to be useful no matter what game system you're going to run a game in. They're especially useful for narrative systems like Forged in the Dark games, of which Children of Midnight is one. So, last week in our first session, we talked about how to prepare a campaign idea to be presented to potential players. If you want to be a part of this game, or if you just want access to some of the materials that we'll be presenting here, log into our Discord and you'll be able to get access to any of the information as well as join in the game if you're interested as a GM or a player. Our Patreon supporters have highest priority when it comes to joining in the game. Second highest priority goes to anyone who is willing to GM a session, which includes myself and Isabella DeClan. Anyone else who is willing to GM will make their way to the top of the list quickly. But if you want to be guaranteed a spot, become a Patreon supporter at any level, and we will guarantee you a spot. So, let me start by letting you know what we came up with last week and sort of what I distilled down from all the things we talked about over a little over a 2-hour period. And this is the sort of looking for group pitch that we ended up with. In the dark recesses of an eldritch place of vast power, a group of witches worked to open the doors to the outer planes of thought and imagination, hoping to create a home for themselves beyond limits, beyond suffering. None know for sure how successful they were, but the repercussions of their ritual are still felt. The astral plane, possibly in retaliation for this act, has begun to splinter into our reality. The creatures of myth and fairy tale are causing fear, chaos, and havoc across Manhattan. A powerful group is in contact with your coven. They want you to use your unbound powers to locate and close these intrusions. Are you up to the task, or would you work on your own terms from the shadows? I tried to leave as much as I could open-ended. I tried not to answer any questions for the players, although sort of pushing them into possible paths. That way, if they don't have an idea or if they don't have a strong opinion, they have some easy choices to make where they could take it in one direction or another. And if they do have a strong opinion, then at least they have a couple outlets that we've sort of pre-planned for them. And if they want to come up with something that goes completely off into left field from where we started, at least we have a starting point that the rest of the group might be able to agree on. A little extra information of creatures from people's imaginations would be coming into the world through these rifts. This could work in any number of settings or game worlds. It would work especially well in a game like Werewolf the Apocalypse, and of course, extremely well in Children of Midnight Coven. So, we put that pitch into our Looking for Group channel, and got everybody who was interested to sign on to that. And we did get enough potential GMs to feel like we had a good chance of getting a group together. If you were doing this for yourself through a Discord or through any other method, even if you were talking to your friends about where you wanted to go from here, you have a good starting point with that campaign pitch. Glad everybody likes it because it's mostly your ideas. I can't take that much credit. The next few things that I'm going to go through in my outline don't have to happen in this particular order, and we're going to talk through each of these things, why they're important, and how to go about them. So, the first step is to gather your players. If you're on a Discord, make sure you have enough players. If it's your first game that you've ever run, a small number of players is probably a really good idea. That way you have a chance to get some of the basic rules and concepts down in play without having to worry about being overwhelmed by all the different choices and character types and everything that people might be playing. So I recommend, especially if you're starting out as a GM, 2 to 3 players. Some games make that easier or harder. Forged in the Dark games tend to be a little on the easier side to run because a lot of the narration of the game gets shared between the players and the game master. So the next thing, largely out of the hands of the GM, is for your players to generate their characters. Sometimes this can be done live, or that you're all around the same table, or a Discord voice chat, things like that. If you can, make this part of your session 0. If players start generating their characters early, that's not generally going to be a problem, because it's the players that are the most excited that are probably going to generate their characters early. In the case of Forged in the Dark games, after character creation, you have another step. In Children of Midnight, that is creating your coven. In other Forged in the Dark games, like Blades in the Dark, that is creating your crew. A coven or a crew are a shared character sheet that every member of the player characters belongs to. It has its own stats and abilities. It's kind of like an extra character. In the case of Children of Midnight Coven, there are a lot of other rules and experience triggers on the Coven sheet for the players to understand. It's really important for that to be part of your session 0. So, the next step, after the players have made their characters and their crew or coven, it is time for the GM to come back through, sort of modify their campaign pitch. You're going to take these abstract ideas that you came up with in your pitch, and you're going to solidify them down into truths about your campaign. And most likely, you're going to be able to keep a lot of those ideas. But if you have a very strong-willed player that has a really strong idea of the character they want to play and the stories that they want to be involved in, you might need to sort of go back through this with everybody else and make sure that everybody is still on the same page with the modifications that you've made to your campaign pitch. So, let's make a specific example. Let's say that nobody seems particularly interested in the intrusions being astral in nature. They aren't things that come from the imagination, they are coming from the underworld, which is a change to the system. You could still tell a lot of the same stories, bringing spirits and things like that from the underworld rather than from the astral plane. That's a potential change to your pitch that you would want to go over with the rest of the players. You could have a player that says, oh yeah, my character was there. They were a part of the ritual, and when everybody else got sucked up into the astral plane, I was one of the few that was left behind. And I've been searching for a way to get back there through one of these intrusions. As long as all the players are down with that, that can absolutely be a starting position of your coven. So, Children of Midnight Coven and Blades in the Dark, you want your players to take charge of the game. More than most other systems, they should be allowed to insert their characters directly into any point in your storyline. Don't feel so much ownership of your story that you have to relegate the things that happened to NPC factions. It could absolutely be caused by the player character. They could be trying to set things right. Whatever they feel strongly about is the perfect hook to start the game on. I would even go so far as to say, if the players don't seem to be particularly excited about the pitch, then it might not be a good fit. You might want to go back to the drawing board and say, if you're not exactly feeling this, if you don't know where your character could fit into this world, then maybe we need to all sit down during our session 0 and we need to create a new campaign pitch that is more inclusive and more personal to your characters, whether they've made those characters yet or not. I feel like that is a bit outside of the realm of what you normally do in a lot of other GMing styles and a lot of other games. Like in Vampire the Masquerade, it would be really uncommon for you to say, and this is a example straight out of literally a game, to have a player come to you and say, I want to be Vlad the Impaler's surrogate mom, who's a vampire. In most GM's minds, that is way too far. It's too invasive into the story that you have in your head. In my games, that's exactly where I want us to be. I want us to already be a strong, vibrant part of the story, because that is what is going to create the most engagement for your players. We are joined by the lovely Anya, the player of that character that I just described.
No, it was me.
It was you. Yeah, Struggle Princess says this way of playing is easier for new GMs. And I think you're exactly right. GMing a tabletop game is a lot like improv. So, consent forms in tabletop games have been around for a while. I think the first major published one was by Monty Cook Games a couple of years ago. And I think Fate has a consent toolkit now as well. Children of Midnight Coven has a consent form built in. Alright, so this is the Children of Midnight consent form. I use TV show ratings, because I like to think of our sessions and stuff as like episodes of a TV show. I give our games the same kind of rating that you would see on a TV show. Write down what the planned themes of the game are. So if we're going to be talking about the underworld a lot, or if we're going to be talking about the astral plane a lot, I'm going to put in the themes. So in our case, I would put something like imaginary creatures, mythological creatures, fairy tale creatures would be part of the planned themes. Maybe we'd end up going into some dimension hopping too. So I might put something like that in there as well. If you see here at the bottom, green refers to enthusiastic consent, bring it on. Yellow is veiled or off screen, discuss first. If something's here in red, it's just not going to happen. As violent as our tabletop games can get, there are definitely some boundaries. Torture, right there in the violence section, is completely unmarked. You know, I noticed during our last session that I went off screen, and I'm realizing that maybe I need to put a X there in the yellow line for that, because I realized yesterday that I wasn't comfortable talking about it directly. As a GM, if I'm going to make a change to this document, I'm going to discuss it with the players. If a player feels the need to make a change to this document, I don't feel like they need to explain it to anyone, but they should talk to the GM so that they can make sure that we see the change that they made to the sheet and we can act appropriately. So we talked about green and we talked about yellow. Red is a hard line. Do not include this in your game. Anything with a asterisk says, please add specific examples. Struggle Princess asks, this might be for a later session, but what would you do if something comes up mid-session, like something triggers a player or GM without them knowing that it would happen? Since you asked, if you go back to, I think, episode 21 of Night Sky Sanctum, we realized that we had a issue that we needed to pause the game and talk over. Anya spotted a problem and they were able to say, hey, let's cut that out. Let's not talk about that specific thing anymore. And so that's an example of what I would call a yellow card. So in the same way that we've got green, yellow, and red here, you can have yellow and red cards. And if anyone has something that is starting to bother them or they're a little bit worried about it going too far, they can show their yellow card. So that could be holding it up, or that could be tapping it on the table if they had it on a table in front of them. And then if something is completely off limits, they could hold up a red card, or they could tap their red card. They could make an X with their hands, anything to just get the GM's attention, or even other players' attention if the GM is not doing a good job and not paying attention to them. Get someone's attention, show that there's a problem, and play should come to an immediate halt. If we're playing on a stream, we can go to a break and discuss it off camera. Yeah, so that's called like yellow card and red card as a sort of at the moment consent tool for changes of consent. Those should be honored immediately. Like the stoplight system, exactly. Yellow, proceed with caution, or let's take this off screen. Red, stop. You don't need to ask any questions about why we're stopping. We can transition to the next scene immediately, or whatever works to get us past that moment. In Discord, there are yellow and red icons that you could use that you could just put into chat. You could type the word yellow or red or say stop. That's probably something that players and GM should have some documentation around so that everybody's on that same page. Now, speaking of the same page, there is an awesome tool called the Same Page Tool. This was invented by someone named Bankway. It is a form that the GM and players fill out live during session 0, and it lets you all get on the same page. Now, it seems like it was made for games like Call of Cthulhu, D&D, Pathfinder, those kind of things. So it's got some really specific stuff that's not in a lot of narrative games, like how do you want to handle character death? That's not something that we generally handle in a Forged in the Dark game. Player characters can die, but it's 100% the choice of the player. I had never heard of narrative games when I first found the Same Page tool. And if anything pushed me toward narrative gaming, that was probably one of the first things that made me sort of tick over toward narrative gaming, was realizing that that's actually something I have a choice in, that our players should have a choice in. I've actually had players get upset that think, if my character can't die, then this game doesn't have consequences. And that is absolutely not true. But if that's how you feel, then, and we can't get on the same page, then maybe you're better suited to another game. And maybe we are better suited to running this game without you. The last thing that you want to do at the end of session 0 is you want to discuss what session 1 is going to look like with your players. The reason why I do this is because I might want to run something epic right off the bat. So if I'm going to put them in a weird or unusual situation, or if they're going to start the campaign right in the middle of some action, I want them to know that ahead of time. Hopefully a week before they're playing, so that they can sort of prepare for that. In the game that I'm currently writing, the Viking game that I'm working on, I just wrote the sort of setup for that the way that I ran it the previous time. And the way I ran that one was session 1 is going to be a day in the life of session. So it's going to be like when you watch Lord of the Rings or Willow, and you see all the characters going about their normal daily life and all the little fun things that happen to them, and even the boring things that happen to them, and the NPCs that they interact with on a daily basis. Maybe a character's having their birthday, maybe a festival has come to town. And in this game, what I wanted to show and see was for the players to see what a normal day in their life was like, because I planned on absolutely wrecking that. And I wanted the normal daily life to be in stark contrast to the journey that they're about to go on. And you see that happening in a lot of classic fantasy material. So, in our Viking game, we had a little sparring between some of the characters, some non-deadly combat. It also helps people get used to the rules, knowing what they roll, knowing how to make an attack roll in the case of simulationist games. That was an evil smile. So yeah, you want them to learn the rules. And a day in the life of can be a great way to learn those rules in a safe manner. You're rolling initiative not because you're being charged by a bear, but because you're playing tag with somebody or running a race. So you do these sort of consequence-free or light consequences version of the game rules. So people can go, oh, I probably should have put more points into X, Y, or Z skill because it's something that I overlooked. In the case of vampires, we've had a lot of players that overlooked combat skills, not even thinking about the fact that I am probably going to have to brawl somebody to bite them and get the blood out of their body. So I probably need to put a point or two in brawl, even if I don't think that it would have been important to my character. Maybe I was thinking of my character as the human before they became a vampire, and not the person who has to go out and drink blood every night to survive. Mentioning blood reminded me, there is a point at which you might decide that because of the lines and veils, you might not be able to adequately tell the story that you have come up with. This might be apocryphal, this might not be something that actually happened, but something I heard about back in the Google Plus days was someone saying, I'm really interested in playing Vampire the Masquerade. And the GM said, that's awesome, I love running Vampire the Masquerade. What do you all want to do? And let's get together and let's discuss it. And they said, I only have one stipulation, no blood. And it's up to the GM as far as whether they feel like they can run that game adequately. At first, I thought that was hilarious, and I thought, shunt that player to the side and go about with running the game that you wanted to run in the first place. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I could probably run a game like that and be perfectly happy with it. It is an interesting limit for a vampire game, for sure. I don't think a lot of my players would be interested in going along with it either. But if I did have a group and they said, I'm interested in doing something like that, I feel like maybe not in Vampire the Masquerade, but in another game that has vampires, maybe you can say, our vampires are psychic vampires. So, something to consider. There are limits to what you might be willing to run, and those limits might actually be someone's line or veil. Someone's line or veil might make the game seem uninteresting to you. That's one of the reasons why we have these tools. You could jump to Asian vampires, a whole party of Colin Robinsons.
No!
If everyone that's here ends up playing, or GMing in this upcoming game, then we'll be able to stick with what we have here. If not, we might end up redoing some of these consent forms and stuff. And remember, they are living documents, so they are allowed to be changed as the game goes on. What we have here is the important aspects of a Coven sheet that we need to help us with those steps that we talked about earlier. As I said, the order of things don't matter too much. You could probably create a Coven before you've created the player character, as long as your players are down with it. Let's treat this as if we're doing just that. We're going to make the Coven and figure out what the Coven's goals, what the Coven's relationships are first. So, what factions they've interacted with in the past off-screen. I say off-screen, but these are things that you can come back to at a later point in the game. So they are the starting condition of the Coven, but they are also things that you can play around with as a GM and as players at a later point in the game. So we'll just take a random example. Let's say we throw a -2 relationship on Shop Hub. That means that we have a very adversarial relationship with what is effectively the Amazon.com of our game world. So that's the kind of thing where if we decided that as a group, then maybe all of the players, or at least most of the players, would want to sort of mentally come up with something that is the reason that they've had those run-ins with Shop Hub. Maybe they were caught shoplifting in the past and were shipped off to the Ever Vigilant Eye for correction. Down with fantasy capitalism. Mundane organizations are probably the biggest capitalism stand-ins. Cyberotics as well, and then DRG. They're sort of the pharmaceutical industry. You've got the mundane police, Obsidian Council, and then you have the #1 job creator in the game world for mundanes, which is Shop Hub. Cytherian says, do you think we can take down global capitalism by the end of Season 2? I think if you worked really hard and had some really good ideas of how to go about it, there's a possibility. Yeah. We could start the season with you, like, about to pull the switch to shut down capitalism, and then we can do the whole rest of the season in flashbacks of how you got there before you make that roll and see how you did. That's a good time for me to tell that story, because I've told it to our players in Night Sky Sanctum, but I don't think I've had a chance to tell this story. Again, like the last story I told, not sure if it's actually true or if anybody's actually done it. But there's this sort of urban legend around Blades in the Dark. There are factions that are in control of a lot of parts of the game world. But there's a tale of a adventure that was run in which the player characters decided when they made their crew of assassins that they wanted to assassinate the God Emperor of the game world. And the way the GM decided to implement that storyline was for them to be standing, sword drawn, at the throat of the God Emperor, with all of the guards around, about to do the actual roll. Do they kill him? It all comes down to this one die roll. That's where the game starts. Because of the interesting way time works in Forged in the Dark games, the player characters would say something like, okay, well, if I were to try to stab him, what would the position of that be? Oh, desperate, absolutely. There are guards all around you. The God Emperor himself has who knows what magical powers, what rituals that protect him, right? All this stuff. The position is definitely desperate. Well, what's my effect level gonna be? Oh, it's gonna be abysmal. Like, I would say if you rolled a 6, it would be reduced in effectiveness down to basically you put a scratch on his neck. And so the players could say at that point, I want to do a flashback. I want to go back to a time when we put together a plan to dispel the ritual that protects the God Emperor from being killed. That basically the spell that makes him immortal. And so you flash back to that adventure, and you run that adventure as if it's happening, but it happened at some time in the past. And if you're successful, then when you flash back forward, the GM says, well, now the position is still desperate, but your effect level, rather than being nearly nothing, is like, you could do some damage to him. You're probably still not going to kill him on a 6, but if you crit, maybe you'll kill him. And you just keep doing that. You keep doing flashbacks. You keep making changes to where you are until you get to the position where you say, now I feel good about making this roll. I think we can do it. And then you do it. And whatever you roll, you go with it. You move forward with the campaign. So, I don't know if that's ever actually really happened, but it's sort of a story that people tell about Blades in the Dark. So, something to think about as far as when you're generating campaign ideas, when you're coming up with a campaign pitch. That's how out in left field you can go. If you have an idea, if you want to kill the leader of the Order, that would be an interesting way to start that game. You could also start from, we come from Appalachia, and we're going to drive from our little town in Appalachia to Manhattan, and we're going to start the campaign from the ground up, rather than starting from the pivotal moment and working backwards until we eventually catch up to the moment that it's all happening. Those are all things you can do when you're coming up with a pitch for a game. So, if you've got wildly ambitious characters, it could be very exciting. So what we are going to do is we're going to effectively create a coven. I'm going to run you through a few of those steps. The first two and the easiest to start with are these two drop downs for Coven upgrades and greater rituals. These are all the Coven upgrades that you can get in the game. You can make up your own as well. And then these are all the greater rituals. Starting Coven starts with one of each. You might think, how does this shape the game? Well, if your Coven has a boathouse, then that tells you immediately as a GM, players want some water action. They want to interact with some of the factions like Rara Avis that's on an island, or the Vile Legion, a faction of pirates. They probably want to interact with the floating market. They might want to go to Riker's Island, which is where the Red Watch keeps witches that they're unable to properly bind and that they think are too dangerous. Just having a boathouse can tell you a lot about what the player characters want to see in the game. Now, you might have some people that are like, ooh, I want Prowess Training. And you might think, well, that doesn't seem very interesting, but it tells you where they think they have a weakness with prowess-related actions so that they can bring those actions up to a useful level. Or it might mean that they want their characters to all be like bodybuilders and things like that. So the other thing that's really important to the GM for player characters to pick is faction relationships. When you make a coven, you get to choose 2 factions to have a positive relationship with. This means that You've had positive interactions with them in the past. You've helped them. Maybe they're willing to scratch your back in return. And those you get a +1 with. You get 2 of those. Then you get 1 that's a -1. That means that they have a negative relationship with your coven. It could be that you ran an undertaking that either advertently or inadvertently caused harm to their faction. A -1 isn't so bad. It means that they won't go out of their way to cause you harm. But if you get in their way, they're not going to treat you nicely. And a +1 is kind of the opposite. They won't go out of their way to help you, but if you align with their motives and their goals, then there's no way they wouldn't. Whereas if you have a 0, which is the default, it's kind of up in the air. The other thing you have is a -2. A -2 means that you have a quite bad relationship with them. The worst you can get is -3. A -3 means that that faction is at war with your coven. These will change during play. You start with 2 +1s, a -1, and a -2. It's possible that Ascendium maybe did their ritual within proximity of a big, shop hub location. Maybe it stopped some of their electronics from working or something, caused them a huge financial loss. Or maybe just one of the biggest intrusions into reality from the astral plane managed to wreck something with regards to Shop Hub and cause them a lot of damage. So yeah, that could be your -2. All the magic in the air fucked up all their electronics. Yeah, like an EMP. What if the Order specifically asked us to fix the fuck up? Yeah. So that would be that you probably have a positive relationship with them. I can completely see how we could create a storyline in which the Order sees the reality warping as a bigger problem than the Wild Witch problem. The Order is all about finding wild witches that they consider too dangerous to exist in society. They use propaganda to create that impression, but that doesn't mean that at every level, in every aspect, every NPC that works for the Order is irredeemably evil. I would put that on the advanced side of the spectrum. Interacting with the Order in any regard, or really any of these tier 4, tier 5 factions, is sort of advanced mode, but it absolutely could be done. I would definitely recommend, for an easier start to the game, for us to put the minuses with low tier organizations, tier 1 to tier 3, and that's that number off to the right of the faction, and put your pluses with high tier organizations. So that means high tier organizations have your back, and your enemies are low tier organizations. So that basically puts you in a really good position. The Order wants us to fix the fuck up, and Ascendium wants to stop us, while Shop Hub simply wants revenge. Okay. Yeah, I think that sounds pretty good. So where do we want to put our -2? Do we want Shop Hub to hate us the most, or do we want Ascendium to be the most concerned with stopping us? Would it make sense to have a negative relationship with Ascendium? Yeah, that's possible. Ascendium is an order of astral-based witches, so it's possible that most of them are gone. They have gone bodily to the astral, and they are effectively missing. So maybe that would be a good excuse for them to only have a -1 with you. They just don't have the boots on the ground, as it were, to be an active force in trying to stop you. the Order has its fingers in a whole lot of pies. So it makes sense that they might have a reason, and we can come up with that as a group, or the players can just leave that up to the GM why they've decided to align with Wild Witches. +1 to the Order. Do we have an anti-capitalist coven? Factions that are made up of witches are called congregations rather than covens. Covens imply that they're wild witches, but yes, we do have some anti-capitalist congregations. So we have the Vulture Votary is not specifically anti-capitalist, but they can definitely get on board with anti-capitalist sentiments. The Keepers of the Old Ways are not interested in seeing things change in almost any way, although if you get in good with them, you could probably get a few of the major NPCs to take an interest in some anti-capitalist activities. The Exiled is more anti-order than anti-capitalist, though I could see them working in that direction. The Scarlet Incarnation are assassins and blood magic users. They're not too worried about capitalism, but the Gaian Guardians are eco-terrorists, and they are definitely overtly anti-capitalist. I would say, to a degree, Shadow Dawn, if you want to go into the Fae direction. The Fae are just a little bit anti-capitalist. They have their own version of capitalism for sure. Would the Vulture Votary fight against this specific issue at hand to close these incursions into reality? They could definitely see it as against the natural order of life, death, and rebirth. The Vile Legion are pirates. They're definitely anti-capitalist. We have a +1 with the Order. We need one more. The Vile Legion could be part of the reason that ShopHub doesn't like you. Each player character can decide if they are part of the reason that Ascendium is against you. A lot of congregations, when they're trying to do really powerful magic, will contract wild witches to come and help them perform a ritual, hoping to steer the negative consequences of a big ritual toward the wild witches instead of themselves. So yeah, it's possible that you were witch mercenaries hired by Ascendium to help them with their ritual. So let's decide what Coven upgrade and greater ritual might be the most useful to this group. Are any greater rituals jumping out at you? Telepathic Bond is a great starter because your characters can always communicate with one another over any distance. It can be great if you decide to split the party. Coven upgrades. I'll keep this sheet shared, and if anybody wants to put their ideas in the Discord, we can vote on them there and see if we can get a consensus, because there are a lot of really good choices in there. And I'll write up a little blurb about faction relationships and where we're going from there. And I will also keep the RPG consent form, and everybody who is signing up to be a GM can go ahead and put in their lines and veils, yellows and reds, into this sheet. Patreon supporters can go ahead and put their information in. I will edit this up, and we'll meet back up here in 2 weeks. I will see you all on Discord later. Have a great night.